Today's episode is brought to you by DeSanto Propane. DeSanto Propane is 4 generations strong as a trustworthy family-owned business with unmatched customer service. Go online at DeSantoPropane.com for more info or call toll-free at 1-800-752-4574. Since 1937, the difference has been DeSanto Propane. From FingerLakes1.com, this is the Debrief Podcast. I'm Josh Durso, and yeah, I know it's been a while, but Jackie Augustine and I are back here in the FingerLakes1.com studio, getting ready to talk about primary results, some state election news, and a couple of other things as well. Jackie, it's good to be back.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So you're still writing your column for the Finger Lakes Times, right? That's where most people have probably been keeping up with you.
For better or worse, if they like it or not, yeah, I'm still doing it.
You're still doing the right thing. So actually, the topic I wanted to start off with here is one that I can't believe you hadn't heard about it, but it affects local elections or will affect local elections if Governor Kathy Hochul signs it. A bill that it was approved by Assembly and Senate to move county and town elections to even numbered years. Republicans say that this is Democrats playing politics because it favors them when turnout is higher on even numbered years. Local elections, like a lot of people probably know, or maybe they don't, typically those are held in odd years. So the years that we don't have like a presidential, Senate, congressional kind of race happening. Democrats say that this is nothing more than a move to make elections more efficient. I would assume there's probably some cost savings involved as well. One thing that you and I were kind of batting back and forth here on was trying to figure out if this will affect city or village elections, or if this is only going to affect county or town elections. But as a concept, what do you think about the concept of moving those elections from odd years to even years?
Well, I mean, you're right. It's expensive to run elections. I think people don't think about that, but elections inspectors are paid. There's a lot of stuff the Board of Elections has to do to get ready. So I think as a cost-saving measure, it makes sense. I always find it funny when people say, "Oh, this is an effort to try to get more turnout, and that's a bad thing." I mean, I hope we want people to vote. You said it was the Republicans who complained. I hope that they are not saying that they like it when people don't vote. I mean,
right.
that would be a bad look, I think. But no, it makes sense to me that people, especially this year when, the primaries, this was kind of the first cycle, at least for city elections, where people were seeing primaries in the spring, that between that school board, and then the general election, it feels like every day's election day. It would be nice. Our lawns would be a lot less cluttered if we could consolidate elections. But I don't know. I think it was news to me. I was not tracking that. Town law under New York State and county law is different than municipal law. So I don't know if this does carry over. But I don't know. It sounds like a smart idea, but
I think it's interesting why do people not vote? It's not because all of the things aren't happening at once, right? Like, I think if there's an efficiency to be gained, or maybe an element of comfort to be gained from this kind of change, would be to maybe not feel like we're in a constant state of campaigning,
right? Because
of the new calendar, or it's not really new anymore, but the election calendar from the last couple of years, where you've got people basically deciding whether they're going to run or not in January and February, and then collecting signatures earlier on, and then kind of continuing through when you have, like last year, local elections, an odd year, moving right into an even year, or vice versa, I guess. I could see where maybe this kind of change would make sense, because in some ways it does feel like you're in a constant state of something's up for election.
Right.
But at the same time, you and I have talked about this now for, I feel like 8 years, literally, and turnout has always been terrible, pretty much no matter what people do to try and change that course.
Well, now, strangely, though, this city election was an outlier because turnout was actually higher in the city primary than usual and higher than surrounding jurisdictions, which I guess would be an argument that maybe having this longer off-cycle election helps turnout. I don't know. That's a research question that I don't know how to answer. But
I noticed that because that was one of the things after we published all the primary results, going through and seeing, a lot of rural communities that had primaries across the region, turnout was pretty terrible.
Yeah, handful of people.
Yeah. And I mean, it's on one hand, it's terrible to think that, so much is being decided by so few of the people who actually live in those communities. But obviously voting is not required. And the other part of it too is, to me, it kind of paints a picture that Geneva just has a more compelling situation unfolding for most people who live there, whether that compelling because they feel very passionately one way or another about it, or compelling because there's been more attention on, for example, the race for mayor or some of the city council seats.
Right.
Then it becomes a matter of, does the messaging need to change about these races to make them more compelling? And when we see candidates in smaller communities try to run under the radar, should we be concerned about that?
Yeah. I think that's true. So maybe moving things to the kind of the even years only will make people more focused on that. I don't know. I think I would hope so. But yeah, I didn't even know that was a proposal. So now I feel out of touch in terms of that piece of news.
There was that week and a half or 2 week stretch after the actual session ended. It was like the bonus session. Mm-hmm. I believe it came out of that.
Interesting.
So it is what it is. Let's talk about Geneva. Obviously, there were primaries, mayoral primaries. There were city council primaries. What stood out to you as far as the results were concerned? Seeing who won, who lost, vote totals, turnout even?
Yeah, I mean, turnout was definitely high, which is great because the city benefits when people are paying attention, right? Yep. So that's excellent. Regardless of what the results are, it's just excellent that people are participating. I would say I was surprised by the outcome being as conclusive, as decisive as it was. I kind of thought it was going to be a little closer because if you talk to people around Geneva, people say, oh, well, there's this divide and, there are two sides. I don't know if that was borne out. I think what it made it look like is actually, people aren't as conflicted about how they want the city to go, that there might be a pretty clear vision that it's time to kind of actually start doing some city business and kind of leave the personalities at the door and actually start working on policy. So I thought that was very encouraging. And yeah, it was also, I just thought it was funny because the argument from some people about the primary was, well, why would we let this Democratic committee select candidates, which is just like how primaries happen, right? But so that was being raised as this really like illicit way of getting people on the ballot. And it turned out, well, no, the Democratic committee, which people should know is an elected position itself, right? To be on the Democratic committee is not an appointment. You don't self-select. Like you have to circulate petitions and be essentially elected to that position. Turns out the Democratic committee in Geneva does reflect the Democrats. So it was kind of a neat thing. I'm not part of the Democratic committee. I'm not involved with the Democratic committee, but they've got to be feeling pretty good that was an affirmation of their platform and the things that the vision they have for the future of Geneva.
Yeah. And let's not forget, anyone who is critical of a committee making a decision, remember, there are other communities that a party will caucus.
Right.
And choose a candidate, which is a far more chaotic, less
Yes.
Participant-friendly environment to get a candidate forward than where you have a committee making a suggestion and then a primary election that follows.
Right.
So I feel like it's a pretty good system.
Yeah.
The question I guess I have is, there's been for the last 2 or 3 years now, chaos on city council,
Yep.
right? It looks like chaos. It feels like chaos. I remember going back to when we saw this pretty significant changeover on city council, you and I having a few conversations about institutional knowledge and whether that was going to have an impact on how city council, how effective they were or weren't over the following years. Here we are at the end of that. And I'm curious how much of it feels like it was institutional knowledge versus issues of the day that were coming up, because I can't really put my finger on which one it is. It feels like a combination of both. But at the same time, I feel like at this point, a lot of the folks who are on city council have gained enough where they should be able to get through meetings, get through issues, and get stuff done.
Well, if they've gained it, they're not showing it. I would just say, I think the institutional knowledge thing cannot be underestimated. And I think that's why the idea of actually moving to staggered terms, I think, makes good sense. I'm not actually sure that the proposal that they've stumbled on for how to do that makes a lot of sense. But the idea that your entire council should not come up all at once was an idea worth pursuing, because we're seeing this council has shown us what happens when you have like really crazy turnover. So the only people on the council right now who've been on before are the mayor, Steve Valentino, and Ken Camera.
Yeah.
And I think in both cases, and I'll say, I've been friends with both. This is not to malign them as people, but I think that there wasn't enough. Trying to think of a diplomatic way to say it. They just didn't do a good enough job of explaining to everybody and demonstrating through their own practice how things actually work. So there was no attempt to kind of coach people on how to produce resolutions that, hey, if you've got an idea, here is how you put forward a resolution. If you don't agree with something, here's how you might put forward a counter resolution. Instead, you've got a couple of counselors who figured it out, right? Who figured out how to put forward resolutions. Then you've got a bunch of people who just didn't like those resolutions, but couldn't offer anything of substance in response except arguments, slowdowns, opposition. And I think that came to bear in the primary where there was no substance to the challengers, the people that weren't endorsed by the Democratic committee. It was like this spooky, well, we can't allow things to go this way. And that just really surprised me because at this point, particularly Mayor Valentino should be well-versed enough to actually put forward policy and make elections about that. Because if the election can't be about a policy, then the city council that would follow would certainly not be about policy either. So I think lack of institutional knowledge was a big downfall of this current council.
I always struggle with this because in city governments or any government that relies heavily on a manager or an administrator, I feel like sometimes the elected folks will rely on those individuals to kind of get us to the meeting.
Right.
And then there's the assumption that all you have to do if you're elected is just show up to the meeting, voice your opinion, raise your hand, say yes or no a couple times, and you're done. But I think that also kind of bears itself out when you have folks get involved in local politics and run for office when they don't necessarily have experience with said body. Yeah. So, I think a really interesting study would be to kind of survey where local politics is now is to go back 25 or 30 years and see how many of those elected to office participated in those meetings before they were elected to office versus today.
Right.
And, I can think back in my, 8-9 years now interviewing candidates, and a number of times over many, many years listening to candidates as they run, share a vague platform and then say, well, if you really want to see me in action, just elect me.
Yeah.
They haven't gone to meetings. They don't speak at meetings. They aren't kind of active in the community directly where like the whole community can see what they would in theory be bringing to the table. And it creates a challenge where it's like, you can kind of bring institutional knowledge, I feel like, to the table if you've at least participated as a member of the public in meetings, because you kind of have an idea of the way things work and structure and everything like that. But some communities definitely rely heavily on the city manager, the administrator, to help them get there. And I'm wondering if Geneva hasn't fallen victim to that over the last 6 to 8 years, just in terms of that's the way it's set up. That's the way it's perceived.
Yeah.
Other cities, I'll use Canandaigua as an example. From the outside, that's certainly the way Canandaigua appears to function. So it certainly wouldn't be a surprise to me if those in Geneva felt the same way, right, about what role the manager was playing. And it's tough because it puts them in a really awkward position, right? Like worst case scenario, like they're kind of the scapegoat if something goes off the rails.
I would say the difference with Canandaigua is that Canandaigua has committees. So even though at the council meeting, it may appear that they're just kind of responding to staff recommendations or making recommendations to staff, a lot of their work happens kind of outside of those meetings. Not saying that's necessarily the way Geneva should do it, but I actually don't like the idea of committees that meet outside. I mean, they are ostensibly open to the public, but I like that the work of the city gets done in the public eye when people are expecting it to be done. But I do feel like, again, after Mayor Einstein, who I think that maybe it's the name, but I think everybody in retrospect realizes was a really great mayor. I think that, the way he structured the council with these kind of working groups that weren't officially committees, but we had particular focus, whether it was infrastructure or return on taxpayer investment or planning and economic development. The idea was that, like, he gave us homework. Like, you need to think about this issue, and then we're actually going to talk about it. And the expectation is that you're going to have not just an opinion, but like a well-reasoned opinion, so that staff is directed what to do. Like Mayor Einstein understood a city manager form of government means council sets policy, and then you have paid professionals who carry that policy out. That's how it's supposed to work. The past few years, it's been, we've got these professionals, so I guess we just show up, look good for the camera, make some noise, make a name for ourselves, and then we leave. And that has frustrated me because, if you look at these guys, half the time they're asked a question or the city manager asks for a response, and they don't even know what. It's like they're totally unprepared, and then they'll ask something or put something forward that she had already addressed 2 months prior. And it's frustrating because then you wonder, well, who are they actually working for? I made the analogy, in the column. We hire elected officials to carry out a plan. Most of these guys should get fired. That is just that's my opinion. And I think, the primary, I think, showed, that's true.
So to that end, and a personal criticism as old as time, as long as I've been reporting or just watching the news in general, is that you tend not to get the most qualified folks when these are part-time positions.
Yeah.
And I know it's so, like, it feels on its face wrong to suggest that we need to give politicians more money or we need to open it up to a wider range of folks. But that's basically what you do by putting some real qualification behind it. I know in Monroe County, the legislature just pushed forward, and the progressive wing of the policy or of the party followed suit and approving of salary raises because you exclude so many people when, essentially, I don't know what Geneva City Council makes, but if you're a city councilor, what do you like $4,000 or $5,000? Okay.
Right.
Yeah. So
and look at how many times they've been meeting.
Right. And even if you're just doing, you figure one city council meeting a month that lasts 3 hours and one other meeting that runs 2 to 3 hours, you're already at a pretty significant commitment when you consider the fact that kind of boils down to like 8 hours a week.
Yeah.
And you've got to answer emails. You've got to answer calls. You should be engaged with the community. You should be out doing city council, actually like trying to figure out what the best fixes are for the city's problems, advocating for the city, whatever you want to call it. I just think we're past the point now, given where the United States is in total. We're past the point of relying on part-time effort to accomplish that, because in the best case scenario is that you find people who are capable of balancing full-time job, life, or have the means to not have to work or whatever, and they come with the best intentions and they do those things. The worst case scenario is you're given 15 to 20%, and the outcome can be show up to meetings, say some things, leave. Maybe
don't think about it for another month.
Right. Yeah. Don't think about it for a period of time. Right. And that's just like it feels like you're never going to have the outcome you want to see anywhere if that's what you're relying on to run your government. That, by the way, all of these, I don't know what the city's budget looks like, but I'm just going to use counties as an example because I've covered more counties over my career than anything else. County budgets are huge now. They're huge. Yeah. And yes, I know you have a county manager, or you have an administrator, and you've got professional staff that are running that, but they aren't beholden to taxpayers. You need professionals who are capable and who have a vested stake in the community, being just as dedicated and engaged as those professionals are.
Agreed. It's funny because
it's impossible to pitch. It's impossible to pitch. Voters would never.
Yeah.
It's just, I know, it's impossible.
Well, and you might have stumbled upon the one issue that I don't know what I think about because personally, I don't understand the money motivation for doing a good job. I feel like you step into that council seat, that's a serious responsibility, and you ought to do the best job, even if you're not paid a penny. But I understand that's not what we're seeing. So, would money incentivize more people? Well, council had, maybe 2 years ago, they put forward a resolution to increase the salary. The argument made, and obviously, again, councils cannot raise their own salary, so it would be for a subsequent term. But the argument was, you can't get anybody except, like you said, people who have the free time or, a personal interest in doing it. And you're missing a large part of the population. Don't you want people who are kind of up and coming in your community to have a stake in where it's going? And you preclude that. And, I remember that one of the counselors, my counselor, said, well, those people should just get themselves in better position to be able to do this. As if working people, sorry if your job is, you're a bartender or you're working in the service industry, work at a hotel or something, and you can't afford or don't have the time to come to these meetings for virtually less than minimum wage. It's like, well, you're not welcome. Well, no, we do need to find a way to make public service viable for people. But I would say you have to build into that some requirements, right? Like people should be having ward meetings. People should actually have to read the materials before they show up at the meeting. I don't know how you would test that. I mean, when they open their mouths, they're failing the test, but I don't know what the affirmative test would be for that ahead of time. You should have to actually draft some policy. You should have to come into it with some ideas. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that just increasing the money is going to move us on those other metrics, because some people are always just going to be satisfied to say they hold a position and they're not going to be motivated to do the work.
It would need to be more structured.
Yes.
And it would almost need to, I guess, feel more private sector than kind of like traditional public service, because I think you'd need to have like hours requirements, and
Right.
you'd need to have more structure, like a normal job, so to speak.
Like a council report. If you didn't attend the groups that you're a liaison to, there should be repercussion. I mean, you go to Rotary and you miss a meeting, you got to pay something. But you go to city council and you haven't been to your liaison appointment in 3 years. Oh, well, I've got nothing to report. That shouldn't be acceptable. But it is. It's become standard operating procedure.
And I'll also say, like, pragmatically, you're kind of looking at it from the dollars and cents side, especially with that example you provided a minute ago with, if you don't have the means, well, do better and, get yourself into a position.
Which is
There's
crazy.
also just the practical matter of, if you say you have a job that pays $150,000 or $200,000 in Ontario County, you're doing pretty well. But guess what? You probably don't have the time to dedicate the appropriate amount of time to a job like city council or any elected position.
Right.
So then the question becomes, like, it's a matter of, like, I almost feel like a salary provides the balance between the two. You'd need structure to go along with it.
Yeah.
But it's almost like, just as much as it would benefit the bartender who wants to get involved, or whatever the case, whatever the lower wage job is, it would benefit that person who's also got a professional obligation at the other end of the spectrum to potentially get involved as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And
only so many hours in the day.
I tend to forget the people at the higher end. Sorry about that. So yeah, you're right. That would be important. And I think also it would respond to some of the concerns that people articulate, that they're worried about the risk that comes with running in serving in public office, right? Like, people are worried that there will be these kind of petty kind of cancellation things where, you say something that people don't agree with, and then you're hated. People try to run you out of town. People want to deny you work. They want to stop going to your business, that kind of stuff. That's a risk. And so maybe more compensation would offset that in some way. But I don't know. I'm not totally sold on the idea that people should be paid more, because maybe I usually am optimistic, but maybe I have a cynical view right now that from what we've seen, you'd have to show me that there would be some accountability for that money before it would be warranted to pay it, right? I'd want to know what I'm getting for that dollar.
Money and structure. Yeah, no doubt.
Because right
There's no
now,
doubt
I
about
feel
that.
like the right solution would be just don't pay them at all, because what we're getting, the output is so low. There's no return on our investment. But, to be fair, I think that people should, in an ideal world, be compensated for a job well done. And there's just a way. How do you find that?
Yeah, and I also think like I said, I think for me, philosophically, the main driver is thinking of the number of people who don't get involved in anything when it comes to public service, because they just can't.
Right.
Because it's practically not viable.
Yep.
And that's, you can have the best intentions in the world, but if you can't figure out a way to make, a $4,000 or $5,000 annual stipend work, you aren't even in the game. So let's stay in Geneva before we shift to Seneca Falls, and talk a little bit about zoning. Been a few stories that I've noticed over the last 3, 4, 5 weeks about zoning. Kind of set the stage for us. What is like at the center of this debate about zoning? I think some of it has to do with housing, in the city. What are kind of like the main points of what really has people concerned in the city?
Well, okay, so in a nutshell, without getting too far in the weeds, the city's comprehensive plan recommended that we redo our zoning because, obviously people who are professionals in this area could see Geneva was about to experience a lot of economic development pressure in terms of Airbnbs and tourism and small business development and housing, not just for seniors, but across income levels and ages, and what people call workforce housing, right? Like you can't run a service-based industry without people who can afford to live and work in those service industries. So a zoning update was proposed with a few key features. That was completed and done by 2020, early 2021, and has just kind of languished. It hasn't gotten any traction. There have been several canceled meetings. There have been several meetings where people just looked at it and said, oh, yeah, I guess I hadn't read that. We'll have to come back another time. We're not ready. We don't know. We don't. Just, again, not really taking the job seriously. And then most recently, there was a meeting where, again, it's kind of held over because people can't get clear on what they think about it. And it's frustrating. Now you're trying to pass zoning in an election year, which just heightens everything because this zoning does two things that are hot button issues. The first is that it finally zones the lakefront open space, right? The consultants looked at all the studies, they talked to people, they had all these sessions, which were very well attended way back pre-COVID. And they came up with zoning that said, look at, like, you can't and shouldn't develop on this section from the Welcome Center down to the state park. And there are some people who don't want to accept that. They're convinced because, they walk on the ground, so they think it's solid. They look at it and they think it's buildable. Or some of them are developers and they want a crack at it, heavily subsidized, and they don't want to give that up. On the other end, on the other side of the city, you've got some neighbors who like their large lot size, agricultural, although there's no farming there, setup. And they recognize that in a city with very little open space, that they could be the next location for development. Unfortunately, what those residents and elected officials have not realized is that the city already has a planned unit development allowance, which means that could happen anyway. But again, because people don't spend time reading the documents or necessarily, learning about the details, we've gotten caught up in this kind of rhetoric that this is an all or nothing, zone it open or zone it large lot, I guess they're calling it now, or you will forever change the character of that neighborhood. And actually, again, a nuanced approach would show that that's not it. But it's going to make a good talking point for the election, so you can anticipate this zoning is not going to get settled before then, because those two things are hot button issues.
So taking the lakefront portion of the issue out of the equation, I, from the outside, can't tell if this is a zoning debate or a housing philosophy debate.
It's both, because see, zoning, for example, other communities that are having this kind of rapid growth that Geneva is, we're having growth pressure, right? Yeah. But we haven't been able to completely accommodate it. So the only thing you're seeing in are people buying up properties from out of state, turning them into Airbnbs or renting them at, increasing rates, right? A one-bedroom apartment now, I just was talking to someone who's renting from $950 to $1,400 in Geneva, right? So that's how we're seeing development pressure play out, because we're not having new development.
Right.
And the reason we're not having new development is because the powers that be see it in this really antiquated way of, well, it's either got to be on the lakefront or it's got to be out on Slauson Lane, and that's it. Zoning actually takes into account then in other communities we look at the lots we already have. So things like accessory dwelling units, something that would allow a senior citizen to keep their house in their family, but live in a smaller portion of it, right? So I'm going to pretend I'm a senior citizen. I'm going to give my house to my kids, but they're going to build me a small suite, either attached to the house proper or in the backyard, and I'm going to live there as well.
Yeah.
That serves both functions. I can age in place, but I can keep my house in the family. Again, we're behind the curve on that. Like, these are the kinds of things that zoning could address. But no one is having an actual zoning discussion. We're having this other argument about, I don't know what, I'm having a hard time following what they're actually talking about because it's just so obvious they don't know what they're talking about.
Hot take. If City Council miraculously passed a complete and finished zoning product, whatever that looks like, all of the housing issues continue because zoning will not fix the housing dilemma that any community in the Finger Lakes is facing right now.
Well,
because I do not see how a community like Geneva, I'll use Geneva as an example because it's right on the tip of Seneca Lake. When you have the Airbnb Vrbo presence that you have and the kind of tertiary markets that exist in that world, combined with the lack of forced development of more units, combined with an economy that's driven by tourism. And while tourism is great for everybody who visits here in the summer, in the spring, and in the fall, and great for a very select few individuals who work at the top of these tourism businesses, meaning the owners, no one else is able to actually buy stake into these communities. If you are working at a winery, if you are working at a bar, if you are working at name the tourism business in the Finger Lakes, really anywhere, even more rural places, you can't buy a house.
Right.
Like maybe if you're a dual income family and both of those people are working 2 or 3 of these tourism jobs, maybe they can swing it in some of the more rural places, but even then you're not swinging it in a place like Geneva. It's not happening in Canandaigua. It's not happening in Victor. It's not happening really anywhere. I'm using Ontario County as an example because of the housing study that's coming close to being complete. And I've talked to some folks off the record about this over the last 2 or 3 months. And we can talk about zoning until we're blue in the face. But at the end of the day, the Finger Lakes region has a livability problem right now.
I agree with you. And I don't mean to say, because I don't want to fall victim to the same kind of magical thinking that I've been critical of in my columns, saying that there's one fix. I agree. But I would say getting your zoning right is like the threshold. We can't even get over the threshold to deal with the actual issues because we can't even set the table to be able to address the issues. And so for me, the zoning is like the baseline. You got to get that passed. Now we can actually talk about how does what's allowed by the zoning now open up our strategy? Yeah. And, the housing study, Ontario County, it's really interesting to watch that because it dawned on me, it's probably obvious to you, but it just dawned on me that the issue at the county and the issue at the city comes down to a very simple truth. The guys in charge just don't have the same perspective and experience of the people that are affected by this, right?
Bingo.
City of Geneva has 1 renter on city council. Ontario County Board of Supervisors,
0.
I don't think any of those guys are renters, right? And they haven't been in the housing market for anything that wasn't like a second property or a potential retirement investment for years. So they don't know. And they maybe their kids are now trying to come back or looking for a house or feeling some of these pressures or working at a winery. But like very few of them are in touch with what the actual economy of the Finger Lakes is right now. So they don't get that our economy, housing is economic development, because you can't sustain this tourism economy if workers can't work in it. And they just don't, like, they're oblivious. Like, nobody's told them that, or if they've told them that, they don't believe it because, you know, they're able to go get dinner when they need it. Like, they don't get what it takes to keep an economy that's tourism-based moving. And I'm not an expert in that, but at least I know to look around and learn from other communities that have had the same experience. We're falling into all the same traps that we could have avoided if we just took it seriously and figured it out. And we just need people that can do that.
Not a completely clean parallel, but I'm going to make this comparison because I live in Monroe County and I listen to a lot of debate about generational poverty in the city of Rochester. There are a lot of parallels when you go back to, when you kind of like trace this back generation to generation of families that are have been on the low end of the socioeconomic spectrum for 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 generations. And the Finger Lakes region, with relying so heavily on tourism, being in the early stages of that, because these, like I say, these people who work in tourism or are relying completely on tourism for their income, they aren't not starting families. Like, they're starting families. Right. And what you're setting the stage for is essentially a generation or 2 generations of people to be raised over the next 20 to 30 years in families that are like systemically behind the 8 ball.
Right.
Because of kind of just the circumstance. I don't think the ironic thing here is I don't think it's any like malicious, like if you're an elected official here in the Finger Lakes and you're looking at me right now saying this and shaking your fist at me, like, I don't think it's any like specific action that anyone in power has taken over the last 10 or 15 or 20 years. It's like literally just the circumstance of economy, capitalism, and where we are right now in terms of like history. And I don't know that, like, you know, when people ask me like what the Finger Lakes is growing so much, like especially in Rochester, I was like, boy, I went down to Naples. It was awesome. Yeah. And they'll talk about it, but like it's this place they went into and came out of really fast, like one day. And when people will frame it as like, I can't believe how much everything is growing down there. It's incredible. Everything's growing. And use Geneva or Canandaigua as an example as well, because they're on kind of the higher end of the spectrum, I guess you'd say. I can't even imagine what a lot of these communities look like in 15 or 20 years, just based alone on the data that we see from schools. Yeah. Enrolled populations are cratering. Yes. I mean, cratering. Just since 2019, I'll use Canandaigua as an example because the numbers are on the top of my head, but like 4 or 5% decline in enrollment just since 2019. That's huge. Like, I remember talking to the superintendent there when I worked on a story about this over the winter, and he straight up said, you know, we know there's actually about a 225 student loss that's going to be reflected in the numbers in a couple of years because of the enrollment, that the way enrollment works in schools. All that to say, you know, I think there are a lot of people who are just very keen on relying on the surface level data that they see and the things that they see around them to believe that everything is okay and everything is going the right direction. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of these bigger issues, housing, zoning, that paint an entirely different picture, especially for the population of folks who are going to be left with trying to figure out what to make of it or how to salvage it in another 10 or 15 or 20 years when, I don't want to call it a bubble, but when the bubble bursts.
Right. I don't even think you have to wait that long to see. I mean, and that's, you know, I again, everyone's like, oh man, you keep talking about this comprehensive plan. We're sick of it. okay, fine, you can be sick of it, but the fact of the matter is it exists for a reason, and the data in it has not been wrong yet. And, this prediction that Geneva was going to face these pressures is bearing out. And what bothers me is that it's frustrating to have had somebody say, here are the trends, here's where things are going, here are some things you can do to improve the quality of life for your residents now and in the future if you start now, and still see people saying, hey, looks fine to me. We don't need to do anything. And I think that's what's been the really frustrating thing about this council, is that this has been 4 years of critical time that Geneva really needs to get its house in order. And it's like, I feel like the attitude from many people has been, who cares? They're totally fine leaving a meeting, having introduced zero legislation, having had zero conversations like this, where you and I are talking about what's the real experience of people. And in fact, there seems to be a hostility to it. Like, a lot of them don't want to hear that some people in Geneva aren't prospering, because it butts up against their narrative, right? Their narrative is things are on the upswing. Everything's going great. Look at what we've done. And it's like, wait a second. There are some good things happening, which I would say are happening in spite of city council, right? Just because we've got some really scrappy, great small business owners and, residents who are getting things done. But we got to be realistic about what the lived experience of residents of the city of Geneva are right now and what they're facing. And you start talking to people who are renting or looking for a house, or who are in a house that needs some work, it is not a pretty picture. And, but, I just think people either, and I agree with you, I don't think it's malicious, right?
No, yeah.
I understand that there are people who will watch this, or who listen to other things that you're producing, or things that I'm writing, and they get upset and they feel like they're not getting a fair shake, or they're being maligned. I'm not saying that
it's bigger than them.
Yes.
It's literally bigger than them.
It's bigger than them. And all I'm asking is that they please just pay attention and be at least aware of it and working toward a solution. I'm not saying, they could have fixed everything and they didn't. But I do think, you've got to take some responsibility. That's the old cliche, right? If you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. Or is it?
Well, and to that end, so
like
I'm sitting here looking at the other two things that we have to talk about that are related to the Finger Lakes, are related to Geneva. And one is economic development, which Geneva has new economic development leadership. Hooray. That's great,
that's
right?
Wonderful.
But economic development is a housing problem, as like those two things are connected and have to be connected and have to be approached together. And then you've got the Forbes article, which got a lot of play on social media, calling the Finger Lakes the new Napa Valley, blah, 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 blah. Awesome. Great. The Forbes article kind of rubs me the wrong way because, again, it contributes to this idea that
everything's fine.
Everything is great. And the Finger Lakes region is this plush, wonderful place where everyone who lives here.
Visitors.
Right.
Yes.
But like, is the Finger Lakes region going to evolve into kind of like a ski resort where people, the workers have to like teleport in during the season and then leave during the winter because they literally can't survive other than the people who own the businesses and the people who are affluent enough to be able to own a second home here or whatever the case may be? Like, that is, to me, and when you talk about economic development especially, I would say if there's anything good to be said about economic development is that economic developers across the Finger Lakes have been able to succeed. I'm going to use your line here in bringing development in spite of the major housing issue and the population loss problem that this community has, because you might have enough workers right this second. But when you look at school data, which I've talked to some Western New York business owners who are seeing the same kind of thing out in kind of the Niagara Falls, Buffalo, Lockport area, where they're experiencing the same thing. Schools are shrinking and you might be able to swing your business right this second. but are you going to be able to staff it 10 years from now, 15 years from now? Like
Right.
if you own a business, you've probably got multiple loans. I doubt very many businesses are cash businesses. You've probably got loan terms that are longer than 10 or 15 or 20 years. And that is very much like a housing and population issue.
Yep.
So, it's just such a complicated thing. And I don't even know necessarily, I'm not saying I have the answer on where to begin, but it's like, you can't approach any of these issues individually and just try to fix the one issue. Like, all of the issues need to be approached at the same time, basically.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point because, you ask people, especially, oh my goodness, it's election season, right? Everybody's talking about economic development. Well, what's the there, right? If I push back and say, what does that mean to you? Well, this is what was, distressing and frustrating about in the primary, economic development being defined by Guardian Glass and, the Ramada and Zotos. Okay, that is a traditional notion of economic development. We're going to get a big industry in here. First of all, those industries, like you just said, are playing a long game.
Yep.
They're looking to invest not for today, not for 2 years. They are playing the long game. Growth begets growth. We do not have population growth. We are not going to have industrial growth. But that's not something they want to hear or respond to, right? If they're an elected official, don't try telling them that. They don't like numbers. But then, so what does economic development actually mean or look like in our economy? It's housing, it's childcare, it's workforce development, it's, training, it's recruiting the next generation of actual residents of the area and not just tourists. But that stuff's boring to people. They don't, that's not sexy. That doesn't, you're not going to get elected on a childcare platform because people don't want to talk about that stuff. But the truth of the matter is that economic development professionals, people who actually have success in the field, get this. And I don't know how they communicate it to elected officials because elected officials have a hard time understanding that economic development is not project-based, it's quality of life-based, it's community development-based. So
I'll also say that before we switch to Seneca Falls here, over the last 3 weeks, I traveled down to South Carolina, and one of the things that I noticed on the way down there, and then once I was down there, and as I was doing some research afterward, is that there's a lot that the state could and should do to make economic development easier, to make
definitely
starting a business easier, to make things less intrusive. A really interesting example, and this is just one very small example that kind of fits into what we've been talking about. But in South Carolina, if you have a retail license, you can sell alcohol. There is no liquor license. There is no secondary, there are things that the state could do to make doing business in New York easier, less expensive, more cost effective. And that's part of it. And I understand a lot of the forces that elected officials or even economic development professionals are fighting are state related. But at the end of the day, there are things that they can do. I'm not saying it's an entirely all them or them situation. It's there are things they could be doing. But
yeah, that's a great point.
It's just a challenge. Anyway, let's talk quickly here about Seneca Falls. There was a contested primary for town supervisor. Frank Schmitter, Mike Ferrara, both Republicans, both running primary. Outcome was more decisive. If you want to talk about decisive outcomes, I think it was more decisive than a lot of people expected. Ferrara, the incumbent, lost by quite a margin. I I think he'll still be on the ballot in November. That's yet to be figured out. I think
it says he's running on the
conservative line. Yeah. I don't necessarily. I think it's challenged to win from the bottom of the ballot like that, especially if Democrats were to endorse Schmitter, which is what I kind of see playing out here in Seneca Falls, because there isn't any other obvious candidate who's been milling around over the last, few months. All that to say, I think this election cycle is going to be very interesting because it is the first time, and I'm going to say this out loud so everybody in Seneca Falls hears it. This is going to be the first time we don't have an anti-landfill candidate running for supervisor. Frank Schmitter is not an anti-landfill candidate. Plain and simple. I'm not saying whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I am simply saying that both of these candidates, after I interviewed both of them ahead of the primary, expressed interest in creating basically the best case scenario deal for a host agreement should the DEC approve the extended permit, which would run which would run Seneca Meadows through 2040-ish, or so that's the thinking. Set Local Law 3 aside of 2016 for a moment, because I don't think that's going to really, I don't really think that plays much of a role here at this point, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on which side of the argument you are there. But I think this is a bit of a different, just paints this race in a completely different complexion for the town of Seneca Falls, which has been so engaged in making basically the landfill the primary issue heading into general elections. I don't think Seneca Meadows or its parent company would have to spend as much money on the election or anything of the sort. It's interesting because, as far as I can tell, when I talk to folks who are a part of the let's find a way to close Seneca Meadows and move on from landfilling in the middle of the Finger Lakes, the opposition hasn't subsided, but it's going to be notably absent here, because I think we're kind of poised with a scenario where both candidates will be touting their ability to strike a deal with Seneca Meadows should the DEC rule favorably on their extension, which, for what it's worth, I'll put it out there, my feeling is that New York State is going to greenlight this, because it would not make a heck of a lot of sense for the Hochul administration or the DEC as it currently exists, short-staffed and stressed at every corner, to try and figure out what you're going to do with the volume of municipal waste that is coming to Seneca Meadows on a daily basis now. Because it's almost as if they were going to deny that permit extension, they would have to be simultaneously coming up with a plan at the state level for where to redirect. Right. And as far as I can tell, that's not. Yeah, that hasn't happened.
It's way easier to keep a landfill operating than to start a new one. So yeah, I agree with you that they're not interested in that heavier lift of solving a problem. Yeah. So
it's also interesting, I think, having gone through a primary where the landfill wasn't necessarily like the central issue, but it was kind of like the just beneath the surface issue that folks were like talking about. I don't think Democrats have officially chosen anybody yet as far as a candidate goes, but if Schmitter is given the blessing of the Democratic caucus here to run, then you'd see him on both the Democrat and Republican lines in November. And it's interesting because it really feels a bit like a fresh start, I guess, for the town. I guess it would be more compelling if there were two different candidates on the Democrat and Republican line, but this feels notably different because of the landfill issue maybe not playing as much of a factor.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what turnout is because of that, because it does feel like a resignation, right? Like, oh my goodness, well, which of them is able to make the best out of a terrible situation? But I don't know. I mean, obviously the primary, a lot of people in Geneva, it's funny, we're talking about the Seneca Falls primary because I think, what happened in Geneva was just so weird that people were trying to put it in context and they thought, oh, well, isn't this the same thing that's happening in Seneca County? It's like, no, not at all. Like Seneca County had 2 Republicans who were in a primary for the Republican line. And then the Democrats don't have the same selection process. They have a caucus, and then they'll pick somebody to be on the Democratic line. And yes, it might end up being the same person, but that's different, right? It was not the same as people already having a line and then trying to get a second line by primary. So against the selected candidates. So I think more people in Geneva ended up kind of following the Seneca Falls primary just out of curiosity to see what was going to happen. What will be interesting to me is what exactly do they think Seneca Falls can do with whatever money they negotiate, right? Because Seneca Falls, it appears, as I'm an outsider, so I don't claim to know the inner workings of Seneca Falls municipal finance. It seems to me like even with a great deal of money coming in from Seneca Meadows, financially, it's been a struggle. And okay, so you're going to get some more money. What is that going to fix? And what is your long-term plan for getting this community on better footing such that you're not just going to fall victim to the next environmental travesty that can't go anywhere else and wants to locate here and dangles a bunch of money in front of your face that now you feel like you need to fix all your financial woes? Like, is Seneca Falls ever going to get itself to a place where it doesn't need an environmental polluter paying us off to make the government run? Am I way off on that? Is that?
I think it's the exact same problem that every community across the Finger Lakes is going to have that isn't maybe Geneva, Canandaigua, kind of like your Newark Lions.
Right.
A lot of these communities, I just feel like aren't viable long term. Yeah. I hate to say it, but like you talk about the enrollment, I mentioned enrollment decline. Yep. You look at population decline. You look at loss of business. You look at the fact that most business that's left here is just tourism. And I say just tourism. I'm not, all you tourism business owners, we love you. You're the best. But it's not the same as having the businesses. Seneca Meadows is one example.
Right.
But like, there are other you mentioned Guardian Class. You can talk about Gould. You can talk about ITT. You can talk about different businesses, Bonadette. You can talk about larger businesses, mid-sized businesses, I guess you'd say, right. That can be staples in the community and serve as kind of like a tax base beyond property tax. Because when you have, again, another problem that pretty much has to be addressed through an approach of what's our economy, is these people, maybe eventually we see a point where, some of the folks who are working in these in the tourism industry can't afford the houses that they can't afford right now. Are they going to be able to afford the taxes that come along with them to maintain the municipal services that everyone else has been granted over the last 50 years? Yeah. Like there are kind of like fundamental, what are we doing here questions about like every city, village, town in the whole region.
Yeah, they're having like an identity crisis.
Identity crisis, a midlife crisis, whatever the case may be. What are we doing? How are we approaching all of these things? And do we have a plan that's actually like viable for them? Like I think of the town of Seneca is, I think, a good example of like one way that you can operate using landfill revenue or a revenue source like that to basically, haven't they affected like zeroed out everything? Tax. Just everything is zero. Okay, cool. So like that's one way of approaching it. I guess Seneca Falls would be the opposite approach of that, which is a lot of inflated services, aging infrastructure that desperately needs help, and will continue to need help over the next several decades, with or without a major contributor in a new host agreement like a landfill. Right. It's like, how do you support, how do any of these communities support that? Like, it feels like to me, when I look at this really like objectively, a lot of counties, Seneca being one of them, Yates being another, are kind of all barreling towards a point where they have to either be supported by the state, or they all just have to become one entity that is governed by one thing and cost controlled to a really serious extent, just so it can continue existing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, when New York State unveiled their shared services incentives many, 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 many years ago, right?
Yeah.
I think that was the result of some public policy wonks who I love, right? I mean, I don't know them in particular, but I love people who do this kind of stuff, who said, hey, exactly that. Like, you've got so many layers of government. You've got so much redundancy. You've got so much infrastructure that is segregated off by these boundary lines that don't really make a whole lot of sense given today's reality.
Yep.
How is any of this going to get done when you have to have 4 layers of government to address it?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think those shared services agreements and municipal consolidation incentives really went far enough. Now, I know that's a sore subject over here in Seneca Falls, because the promise that everything would be more manageable necessarily didn't bear out. But I think that might have been a question of scale, right? Like, was that enough to get where you needed to be? And when you say you look at like Yates County, it might be that it's funny that you said earlier that there are a lot of things the South does, South Carolina, that makes things easier. Well, one of the things that people never want to talk about is that in Southern communities, like, you can annex and consolidate municipal entities just by proving that you're doing it or can do it better. We don't have that. Here, we're so territorial. Mm-hmm. We are so, like, I don't know. Again, it's an ego thing, right? Like, no one's going to dissolve my town.
To your point, county government in a lot of states in the South is the smallest form of government that exists.
That is where I was headed with the Yates County analogy. That at some point, you've got a lot of people who are vested in, well, I'm the supervisor, I'm this, I'm that. They like that. And at some point, someone's got to say, you know what? This isn't sustainable. People will have a better quality of life if we just deal with the infrastructure issues, if we just have one highway department that takes care of the roads. And people say, oh, that means a lot of people are going to lose their jobs. No, it doesn't mean that, because a single county running things, I mean, it's not like you go to South Carolina and their county government is bare bones and has no employees. No, they are right-sized for the job.
Yep. 100%.
And we don't know how to do that here. We're so entrenched in how we've always done it that it's like economic development passes us by because we can't get out of our own way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a whole, I mean, are we ever going to change that? I don't know. I'm not going to stop saying it and trying, but.
Just one last note to kind of put a bow on that and on today's show completely. The opposition that I hear all the time to that is, well, I'll lose my outlet. I want to be able to go to my village government. I want to be able to go to my city government. I want to be able to go to my town government or county government, whatever the case may be. They want to be able to go to that lowest level. But my response is the proof's in the pudding. Nobody's going. Right. Nobody's attending. And if
they are, how's that working for you?
Right. And
is your problem solved?
People aren't turning out to elections. Right. You're having races decided by, 30 to 70 votes. Yeah. You have meetings that open and close without hiding their hair of any kind of like real community engagement or any public bodies there at all.
Right.
And frankly, the third pillar of that to me is you have the data of population and enrollment loss. Take those three things, and it just makes sense that eventually we're going to get to a point where schools and government are all going to have to be consolidated, because whatever you want to blame it on, these communities just won't be viable. Whether it's a Seneca Falls or whether it's a Rushville or whether it's like, it doesn't even matter. And I will say the one piece about, people love to point back to Seneca Falls and say, like, you know, dissolution didn't work here, or they kind of like look at it as like, maybe it didn't work out perfectly. The state benefits to dissolution are way too short term.
Yes.
You can't just have like a couple year benefit. It doesn't work, and it doesn't actually provide any correction if, like, for example, the only plan that's put forward is the one that's adopted, and it's just kind of like taking village government and turning it into town government. All the services stay, all the things stay, and there is no like long term, how are we going to whittle down cost and make this more efficient and make it better? I don't know.
I mean, it's interesting to me, because I feel like a lot of times, and I'm not saying that Geneva, I mean, yeah, should Geneva city and town merge? Absolutely. Like, I've been beating the drum on that for forever. But, you know, I'm not just saying this in regard to Geneva, but you hear a lot of people who talk about, well, you know, I'm moving to Tennessee. They got it figured out. The taxes are lower. I'm moving to Georgia, blah, blah, blah. But then you point out to people, here's what those states do that we don't allow. And they're like, I'd never allow that. Well, okay. Well, you can't have it both ways, right?
Yeah.
If you want to know why things are better economically in certain communities, and I'm not trying to say that, like, the state of Tennessee operates better than the state of New York in terms of budget and that kind of stuff. But again, you hear people say things like, that's where I'm moving. That's where I'm getting a house. Taxes are lower, whatever. Okay. Have you looked at their government structure? Have you seen that the very things you're fighting to keep here in the Finger Lakes are the very things they don't have or have done away with? In most cases, they didn't have it to begin with. That is allowing them to be more nimble. That is allowing them. I mean, Matt Horn, our former city manager, worked for a company that started and stood up and created new metro communities. That was the idea that you need a fresh set of eyes, you need a set of professionals to examine your residents' needs and your facilities and your infrastructure and your resources and do things differently. In Geneva, we had a city councilor who offered to pay for like an independent study of police staffing. And again, as soon as you say that word, everybody gets all up in arms. You know, you push a button, everybody's triggered by it. But the fact of the matter is, he just said, hey, maybe there's a different way to run shifts.
Mm-hmm.
Could that happen? Could anybody take a look at that? No, we are so opposed to having a fresh set of eyes on anything, a different way of thinking about anything. And it's going to be our downfall, because what we're doing right now doesn't work. And that doesn't mean we don't like people, that we're opposed to things. It just means the economy moves on. And if we do not reiterate, you know, if we don't change and adapt, we're going to miss out. And the very people we're trying to protect are going to suffer.
It's just not sustainable. In some ways, it's just not sustainable. Put one final bow on that. Just looked it up real quick to verify my numbers. But last week I was in Hilton Head Island, or on Hilton Head Island, and they are policed by the sheriff's office, county sheriff's office. Now, Hilton Head is a town of 38,000 people with 2.5 million annual visitors, and they do not have a dedicated police department.
You don't want to start that conversation.
But that is just like the most, that was the
quickest way for you to get canceled is to start that conversation.
It is the simplest example of just when you look at everything practically, and I'm not talking about any specific police department, it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't have to be police. It could be water. It could be sewer service. It can literally be anything.
That is the point.
When you talk about sustaining services so that these communities can continue to exist, they aren't going to be able to operate siloed off from each other. They're just not. Like, it's practically not doable long term.
But the Finger Lakes is one big silo, which doesn't make sense because then we're all together. But the whole point is our local governments are used to doing things in these very discrete, we take care of this line and this line only, and we're not looking at anything else, and don't mess with us. And it's like, okay, that's the surest way to go bankrupt. Like, no one would run their household budget like that. They wouldn't say, well, we've always just purchased exactly this thing, always the same. This is how we do it. It's just common sense, but
hey, I think we're gonna have to do this again at some point because I think we just touched on a bunch of stuff that needs a little bit more.
I hope you don't get a bunch of angry messages.
If we do, we do. It happens. Hey, that is all the time we have for today. If you have any questions for us to answer, the email is debrief@fingerlakes1.com, and this episode will be available on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever else you get shows like this one. For Jackie Augustine, I'm Josh Durso. We will catch you next time.